I had been planning that solo camping trip for a while, wanting to get as far away from people as I could. The idea of being completely alone in the woods, away from traffic, voices, and any kind of modern noise always appealed to me. I wanted quiet, I wanted space, and north central Pennsylvania has miles and miles of forests that can swallow you whole if you let them. So I packed up my gear, loaded my car, and drove out on Forest Service roads until they narrowed to rough dirt tracks that seemed more like logging trails than anything else. I kept driving for over an hour, bouncing along, dust rising in the rearview mirror, until I found a small pull-off spot where I could leave the car and start on foot. The trail I picked wasn't much of a trail at all. It looked like it hadn't seen regular use in years. Overgrown brush crept in from both sides, branches reached out across the path, and spider webs stretched across at random intervals. I carried a small stick in front of me just to knock the webs down as I walked. The ground was rocky, uneven, and in places it felt like I was guessing more than following a marked path. But that was exactly what I was looking for: isolation. The kind of spot where you know nobody's going to wander past your tent by accident. I hiked about 6 miles in, following a creek that cut through a valley. The water kept me oriented, but it also meant the land was rough. Slopes on both sides, scattered boulders, roots jutting out, and very little flat ground where you'd want to pitch a tent. I hadn't chosen a destination. I was just walking until I found something that worked. But as the sun began to dip and the light turned gold through the trees, I started to feel the pressure of time. Out there, once darkness fell, it fell hard. That's when I came to a fork in the creek. On the far side of one of the branches, I saw a patch of flat ground that looked perfect. It was open enough for a tent, close to water, and far enough off the trail, if you could even call it a trail, that it felt private. I waded across the shallow creek, water soaking my boots, and started looking around. Almost immediately, I noticed things weren't normal. There was a tarp spread out on the ground near a stone fire ring. At first I thought maybe it was just trash left behind, but the more I looked, the stranger it got. There was a log, about a foot thick, with clear axe marks where someone had been chopping. Nearby, scattered through the leaves and rocks, was the full spread of gear you'd expect to find inside a hiker's backpack. Cooking set, food packets, a first aid kit, even a sleeping pad. But there was no backpack anywhere, just the contents spilled out as if someone had dumped it in a hurry. Down closer to the creek, I found a pile of clothes that looked like they'd been sitting there for a while. The fabric was damp, darkened from the last rainstorm that had passed through only a day before. A towel was hanging from a low branch nearby, stiff and dirty. And off to one side, in the brush, there was an obvious area that had been used as a toilet. Judging by the number of crumpled piles of toilet paper, someone had been there for a week or two. The strangest part of all, though, was the structure. Tucked a little way from the fire ring was a frame made from saplings lashed together. About 4 feet square, with upright posts and diagonal crossbars, forming the skeleton of a cube. It wasn't solid, it wouldn't hold anything in or keep anything out, and it wasn't strong enough for any real use. It looked deliberate, but useless at the same time. I stared at it for a long while, trying to figure out what it could be. A trap? Some kind of drying rack? Or just something someone built out of boredom? None of it made sense. By then, the sun was almost gone and shadows were spreading fast through the valley. I didn't like the idea of staying there, but hiking out 6 miles on a trail I could barely follow in daylight seemed worse. So I set up my tent. Every part of me was tense as I did it, though. The place didn't feel abandoned, not really. It felt like I had stepped into the middle of something, as if whoever left all that gear and made that strange cube might step out from the trees at any second. I carried a 12-inch knife with me, and I kept it in my hand the whole time. Even when I finally climbed into my tent, I lay there with it resting on my chest. Every sound outside made me flinch. A branch snapping, leaves crunching in the breeze, the constant gurgle of the creek. It all layered together until I couldn't tell if I was imagining footsteps or actually hearing them. The tarp outside rustled in the wind now and then, sounding exactly like someone moving around. I barely slept. Every time I drifted close, I'd jolt awake convinced I'd heard something. The woods press in differently at night when you're alone. They feel alive, as if the dark itself has weight. Lying there, I kept picturing some wild-eyed stranger coming back for his things, or worse, realizing he'd left me as the replacement for whatever had happened before. My mind spun through possibilities. Maybe a squatter living out there, maybe someone who had just snapped and dumped everything in frustration, maybe something darker. The longer the night stretched, the more the air inside the tent felt suffocating. When dawn finally broke, I didn't waste a second. I stuffed everything back into my pack with clumsy, hurried hands and tore down camp in minutes. My shoulders ached from tension as I hiked back out, checking over my shoulder every few steps. The trail was just as overgrown as before, but now I felt every spiderweb break across my face and every shadow shift through the trees. The 6 miles back to the car felt twice as long. I didn't relax until I was driving again, bouncing along the dirt roads with the forest shrinking behind me. Even then, the image of that strange cube frame stayed with me. It gnawed at me more than the scattered gear or the damp clothes. Someone had taken the time to build that thing, and it served no obvious purpose. It felt like a message I wasn't able to read, something left there for reasons I couldn't guess. When I got home, I ended up calling the Forest Service. I explained what I'd found, even sent the pictures I'd taken. The ranger on the phone was calm about it. He said it was probably a still, or maybe someone growing pot, or just a loner living off in the woods. He told me they'd send someone to clean it up. I never followed up to see if they did. The whole experience never left me, though. I've camped in plenty of remote places, even out west in Colorado, where I once woke to coyotes howling in a pack around my tent. Maybe 20 of them, close enough to shake the air. That was unnerving, sure, but it was natural. It was part of the land, something you expect when you step into their territory. But that site in Pennsylvania was different. It wasn't nature that unsettled me. It was people, or the trace of people. That sense of walking into something half-finished, half-abandoned, with no explanation and no one around to claim it. The cage of saplings was the worst of it, because it suggested purpose without giving me any clue what that purpose was. In the end, nothing happened. Nobody came out of the trees. I walked away unharmed, but that doesn't erase the tension of that night, gripping a knife in the dark, ears straining for footsteps that may or may not have been real. It doesn't erase the memory of a dog's towel hanging limp on a branch, or the scattered remains of someone's life lying out on the ground like it had been abandoned in a rush. Out there, deep in the woods where no one goes, those things shouldn't have been waiting for me. And yet they were. I still think about it whenever I pack up for another trip. I still wonder if the ranger's explanation was just something simple to keep me calm on the phone. Maybe it really was just a loner living rough. Maybe they'd moved on. But every time I picture that wooden cube, I feel the same unease I did that night, lying awake with my knife in my hand, waiting for something that never came. And I know I'll never camp in that valley again. In the late 1980s, when I was in my early 20s, I took a camping trip with 2 friends in Central Florida. 2 of us were working for the Park Service at the time, which meant we could camp in other state parks for free. For me, camping had always been part of my life. My family camped on nearly every vacation I could remember, from the beaches to the springs to the pine flatwoods across the state. My coworker was just as experienced, but the 3rd friend with us had never camped before. For her, this was a first. We picked a quiet spot, the youth area of the park, which was empty that weekend. It was tucked away, more isolated than the regular campsites, and it seemed perfect. The first night went by smoothly. We set up our tents, cooked, laughed, and settled into the rhythm of being outdoors. Nothing felt unusual. The second day was easy, too. We spent the morning walking the trails, exploring the scrub and hammocks, and then split off in the afternoon for a little breathing room. We were close enough to call to each other if needed, but far enough apart to enjoy the silence. I wandered through the undergrowth, scanning the ground for fallen branches that would burn well in the fire. The Florida woods can be beautiful in their own strange way. Palmettos, /pines, the occasional oak dripping with moss. But they can also feel hollow, empty in a way that makes you notice every sound. It was while I was gathering wood that I got the first strange feeling. I bent down to pick up a branch and, without warning, the thought struck me that I wasn't alone. It wasn't anything I heard. It wasn't even anything I saw. It was just that subtle shift when the air feels heavier, when your nerves start to rise for no clear reason. I stopped and looked around. The woods were still. I listened, waited. Nothing. I shook it off and went back to collecting firewood. But it kept happening. I'd walk a few steps, and that nagging sense would return, like a pair of eyes boring into the back of my head. Each time, I'd turn sharply, scanning between the tree trunks, expecting to catch sight of someone, or something, just standing there. Each time, there was nothing. I told myself I was being jumpy. Maybe it was because of our friend's first trip. Maybe I felt responsible for making sure everything went smoothly. By late afternoon, the feeling had eased up. The three of us gathered again and got the fire started as the sun dipped behind the trees. The air cooled, the mosquitoes came out, and the woods filled with the familiar background of night. Frogs, crickets, the distant call of a barred owl. At some point, the on-site ranger drove over in his truck. He lived only about a quarter-mile away and came bearing firewood and a six-pack. We sat around for a long time, talking, laughing, watching sparks jump from the fire into the darkness. It was after he left that the night began to shift. A while later, we heard what sounded like kids on one of the trails. They were shouting and messing around, voices carrying easily through the night. Since the trails closed at sunset, the ranger and my coworker got into the truck to run them off. That left me and our friend, the first-timer, alone at camp. First, it was fine. The two of us sat close to the fire, talking a little, listening more, enjoying the stillness. But then it happened. Without warning, I felt something cold run across me, like water poured over the back of my neck. Every hair on my body stood on end. My chest tightened, my breath caught, and for no reason at all, I was gripped with fear. It wasn't like normal nerves or the kind of spook you get when you hear a strange sound in the dark. This was deeper, heavier. It was as though the woods themselves had changed, as though something had shifted in the air around us. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just overreacting, but the feeling kept building. I could feel it pressing in, settling into my stomach like a stone. I didn't say a word, not wanting to scare her, but then I glanced over. She was staring back at me with wide eyes. The look on her face told me everything. She was feeling it too. That's when I knew it wasn't just me. Whatever it was real enough for both of us. The fire crackled, sparks rising into the dark, but it felt like we were sitting in the middle of something hostile, something we couldn't see. We stood up, acting casual, pretending nothing was wrong. The car was maybe 50 yards away, and neither of us wanted to run. We didn't want to show fear, didn't want to draw attention, though from what I couldn't have said. We started walking, steady, measured steps, trying to look normal. The feeling only got worse. It was like being watched by something that didn't want to be seen. Halfway there, we broke. Without a word, we both ran flat out for the car. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We reached it, threw the doors shut, and locked them. I grabbed the pistol I had brought, but the metal in my hand felt small, useless. It didn't matter what it was for, whatever was out there. I was sure it was more than I could handle with a sidearm. We sat in the car with the headlights on, staring straight ahead. Neither of us turned to look out the side windows. It wasn't just fear of seeing something frightening. It was the bone-deep conviction that if I turned my head, if I looked, I'd see something that would break me. That thought alone froze me more than anything. Time stretched. It might have been a few minutes, but it felt like an hour. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the feeling began to ease. It lifted, as if a pressure valve had been released. The dread slowly drained away, leaving us exhausted and shaken, but no longer trapped in that invisible grip. A little while later, we saw the glow of headlights as the ranger and my coworker returned. The feeling didn't come back. We stepped out, trying to act normal, brushing it off with nervous laughter, though we both knew what we had felt was real. We finished the trip, but nothing else like that happened. Still, that night stayed with me. I've dealt with storms, wild animals, dangerous people, you name it, but nothing in my life ever hit me like that invisible wall of fear in those Florida woods. I can't explain it. I don't try anymore. I just know what I felt, and I know she felt it too. Looking back, the part that still rattles me isn't that we never figured out what caused it. It's that it came out of nowhere. One minute we were sitting by the fire, calm and content, and the next we were certain we were in danger, more certain than I've ever been of anything. It left as quickly as it arrived, but it didn't leave me unchanged. I've camped plenty since then, but whenever I sit by a fire and the woods get too quiet, I remember that night. I remember the cold dread, the sprint to the car, the way I couldn't bring myself to look out the window. That was the only time in my life when I truly felt that if I looked, if I dared to see, I wouldn't come back the same. And that's a fear I've never forgotten. I went camping in Shenandoah National Park with a buddy from college, and even though I had been camping plenty of times before, that trip left me with a memory I'll never shake. We were both at JMU, which was close enough to make a quick trip up into the Blue Ridge Mountains pretty easy. The plan was simple: take some gear, hike a trail out to a cliff, and watch the Perseid meteor shower. It sounded like the kind of thing you remember for all the right reasons. We borrowed some camping gear from work, stuffed what we needed into our packs, and hit the trail. The hike itself wasn't bad. The air was warm but not humid. The sky was clear, and as we made our way deeper, the sounds of the woods grew thicker. It was one of those out-and-back trails that ended with a payoff, a cliff that overlooked the valley with the mountains stretching out into the horizon. When we finally got there, I was floored by the view. The sun was setting, the ridge lines were hazy, and everything felt bigger than life. I set up my two-person tent on a flat patch near the edge. Nothing fancy, just enough space to crawl in and crash when the time came. My buddy strung up his hammock a few yards behind me, tied between two trees, with a tarp overhead in case the weather turned. Once we had camp sorted, we sat right on the edge of the cliff, legs dangling over, and watched the stars take over the sky. The meteor shower didn't disappoint. Every few minutes a streak of light tore across the black, and we kept pointing them out like kids, even though we both knew we'd lose count. It was one of those perfect camping moments. Quiet, simple, and almost unreal. Eventually, we called it a night. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and stretched out. The forest was calm, just the faint wind and the distant hum of insects. I must have drifted off for a couple hours, but then I woke up to a sound I couldn't place. It was faint at first, soft, irregular taps. I lay there listening, trying to tell myself it was branches dropping from the trees or maybe something shifting outside. But the longer I listened, the more I realized it wasn't just in one spot. The tapping was all around me, circling the tent, almost like it was following the walls. First, I stayed frozen. I didn't move a muscle, my heart hammering as I waited to see if it would stop. But it didn't. 10 minutes passed, maybe more, and it was still there. Tap, tap, tap. I knew it wasn't rain. The night was clear, and I could see the stars through the mesh roof. And it wasn't my buddy either. He was too far away, and the sound was too constant. Finally, I forced myself to move. My hand fumbled for my flashlight. When I clicked it on and aimed it upward, I almost dropped it. Through the mesh ceiling of my tent, I saw them, centipedes. Hundreds of them. They were crawling all over the top, weaving over one another, their long legs moving in frantic waves. Every few seconds one would slip and drop, landing softly on the ground around me. The sound I'd been hearing all that time was them falling from the trees, hitting the tent, and scattering across the leaves. It was like being caught in a nightmare. I froze again, staring upward as more of them shifted above me. The light caught their glossy bodies, segmented and twitching, their legs moving like tiny wires. They weren't just a handful. There were too many to count. It looked like the whole tree canopy had come alive and was pouring down around my tent. I tried to calm myself, to remind myself that they weren't dangerous, but the thought didn't help. They were everywhere. Every few seconds I heard the faint patter of another one falling, sometimes sliding down the sides of the tent before disappearing into the grass. It wasn't just noise anymore. I could feel it, the vibrations of them landing on the thin fabric that separated me from them. Sleep was out of the question. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, my eyes locked on the ceiling. I couldn't bring myself to close my eyes. Every little movement felt like one of them was inside with me, even though I knew the tent was zip tight. The night dragged on, minute by minute, with the tapping never letting up. Meanwhile, my buddy, just 15 feet away in his hammock, was out cold. He didn't stir once. I kept thinking about that, how he was lying there, probably snoring, while I was stuck wide awake inside a tent that felt like it was under siege. By the time dawn started to push through the trees, I felt drained. My nerves shot. As the light grew, I finally dared to unzip the door and step outside. The first thing I noticed was the ground. Scattered all around were centipede carcasses, some crushed, some dried, some still twitching faintly. Dozens of them, maybe more than 100, littered the campsite. They were in the leaves, on the rocks, even tangled in the guy lines of my tent. It was disgusting, more than anything else. I'd never seen anything like it before. Not on that trail, not anywhere. The day before, when we set up camp, there hadn't been a single sign of them. No dead ones, no clusters under rocks. Nothing. And yet, somehow, in the middle of the night, they had swarmed the trees above me and rained down until morning. I packed up fast, shaking off the tent and trying not to gag as more of the things fell out. My buddy, groggy but rested, barely believed me until he saw the pile of bodies himself. He just shrugged it off, but for me, the damage was done. That trip was supposed to be about the stars and the quiet of the mountains. But what I remember most is that endless night of tapping and the sight of centipedes crawling above my head. I'm not afraid of bugs, not usually, but swarms are different. Swarms make you feel trapped, like you're surrounded by something you can't control. Even now, when I camp, I always check the trees overhead, shining my light up into the branches before I set my tent. I know the odds of it happening again are slim, but I can't shake the memory. That sound, the faint patter of legs hitting the ground and fabric, still sticks in my head. The meteor shower was beautiful, and the view from that cliff was unforgettable. But the night that followed reminded me how fast the woods can turn on you. You think you're out there to relax, to enjoy the beauty, and then you're thrown into something you couldn't have imagined. I didn't leave with scars, but I left with a story that made me respect the woods in a different way. And to this day, every time I think about Shenandoah, I don't picture the meteors streaking across the sky. I picture the ceiling of my tent, crawling with hundreds of centipedes, and I remember what it felt like to sit there all night, wide awake, waiting for morning. I went camping by myself in the middle of nowhere, the kind of trip I usually enjoy. I like the quiet and the feeling of being far from people, but this time ended up being much stranger than anything I had ever experienced before. I was in north-central Pennsylvania, and the roads out there seemed to just go on forever without seeing another vehicle. I drove for more than an hour down twisting dirt Forest Service roads, my truck bouncing along on ruts and loose gravel. When I finally reached the end of the road, I loaded up my pack and started hiking in. The trail I followed was hardly even recognizable. It had probably been maintained years ago, but by the time I got there, it was mostly overgrown. Brush leaned over both sides, spiderwebs stretched across, and every step felt like pushing deeper into a place that people had long since forgotten. I didn't see a single footprint. The ground was covered in leaves, and the trail blended so much with the woods around it that if I looked back, I would lose sight of it almost immediately. I followed that trail for about 6 miles, moving slowly because of the rocks and how tangled everything was. It wound through a valley with a creek running beside it, the water rushing through rocks and bends. The further I went, the less certain I became about finding a good place to set up camp. The terrain was rough, and nothing was flat enough to pitch a tent without sliding downhill in my sleep. As the sun started to drop lower, the shadows stretched across the valley, and I began to worry about how far I had gone. Just as I was about to settle for an uncomfortable rocky spot, I came upon a fork in the creek. There, right past the water, was a flat area that looked almost perfect. I was relieved until I crossed the creek and realized that someone had been there before me, and not in a way that felt normal. The first thing I noticed was a tarp lying next to a stone fire ring. The fire ring was cold, but it looked like it had been used not too long ago. Beside it was a log about a foot thick that had been chopped with an axe. Then I started seeing more. Scattered across the ground were the contents of what seemed like a whole hiker's backpack. Food packets, a small cooking set, a camping pad, even a first aid kit, all thrown around in different spots. But there was no backpack. Down closer to the creek, I found a pile of clothes that looked like they had been rained on. A towel hung from a tree branch, stiff from drying in the air. There was even an area that had clearly been used as a toilet, judging by the piles of toilet paper left behind. Whoever had been there had stayed for a while, maybe 2 weeks, maybe more. But the strangest thing, the thing that stopped me cold, was a square frame made of saplings tied together. It was about 4 feet on each side, shaped like a cube but open, with crossbars lashed diagonally across each face. It wasn't solid enough to hold anything inside. The gaps were wide, and it wouldn't have stopped even a small animal from slipping through. I stood there looking at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. My mind kept circling back to how pointless it seemed. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the sun was nearly gone, and the trail was hard enough to follow in daylight. If I left, I'd be hiking in the dark, tripping over rocks, getting lost, or worse. So I decided to stay. I set up my tent in a corner of the flat ground, but the whole time I had my 12-inch knife in my hand. I kept expecting some crazy guy to step out of the trees. That night was the longest of my life. Every sound made me jolt awake. I kept hearing small movements, branches cracking, leaves rustling, but I couldn't tell if it was animals or my nerves. The creek made it harder to pick out what was natural and what wasn't. I hardly slept at all. When the sky finally started to lighten, I didn't waste a second. I broke down camp as fast as I could, shoved everything back into my pack, and crossed the creek again. My heart raced the whole time I hiked out. Even in daylight, the trail felt claustrophobic. Every spiderweb across the path made me think about how long it had been since anyone else had walked there, and that whatever I stumbled onto had been left behind for reasons I didn't want to think about too hard. Once I made it back to my truck, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. The further I drove, the more distance I put between myself and that place, the calmer I became. But it still gnawed at me. I kept replaying the scene in my head. The tarp, the scattered gear, the towel in the tree, and that strange cage of saplings. Later, I tried to make sense of it. Someone suggested that maybe the cage was meant to direct animals into a snare or trap. Thinking about it that way made more sense than anything else I could come up with. It didn't need to be sturdy, just enough to funnel something like a rabbit or a raccoon toward another point where a snare could have been set. Maybe that was all it was, some kind of crude hunting setup. But even if that was true, it still didn't explain why the rest of the camp looked abandoned in such a strange way. I reported it to the Forest Service. They told me it could have been anything. A loner living out in the woods, someone trying to grow pot, or even a still hidden somewhere. But I had walked around up the valley before I set up my tent and didn't see anything like that. And hauling equipment that far in seemed unlikely. In the end, I'll probably never know. Everything turned out fine in the sense that nothing happened to me. I walked away without any trouble, but it left a mark. When I go camping now, I still think about that night. I still think about how uneasy I felt standing in that clearing, staring at a cage made from saplings that looked like it belonged to some purpose I didn't understand. What bothers me most is how quickly things went from a normal backwoods hike to something that felt completely wrong. One moment I was looking for a place to sleep. The next I was in a spot where someone else had left behind traces of their life, but no explanation. It reminded me that the woods, no matter how quiet they seem, always hold secrets. Some of those secrets are probably harmless, like traps or abandoned camps, but some you'll never figure out, and that uncertainty sticks with you. I made it out, I moved on, and nothing bad happened. But every time I think back on it, I still feel that same knot in my stomach I felt when I first saw that strange cage sitting in the fading light of the valley. It was just wood tied together, nothing more. But out there, with no one else around, it was enough to make the whole place feel wrong. That night taught me something important. When you find signs that don't make sense deep in the woods, it's better to respect that unease and not stay longer than you have to. I did the only thing I could do, waited for the sun, packed up at first light, and got out. And to this day, I'm glad I did. It was late, around 10 at night, when my brother came back into the house looking flustered. I knew straight away something wasn't right by the way he stepped through the door, shoulders tense and eyes darting around. He told me he had taken Chester, my dog, for a walk in the woods like he often did in the evenings. We live on a farm in the UK, and the edge of the woods starts barely 15 meters from our front door. For us, it's normal to cut through the fields or head into the trees even at night. Chester had been roaming those paths for years, full of energy, never seeming afraid of anything. But this time my brother returned without him. He told me he'd lost the dog. That alone was strange. Chester never strayed far and always came back when called. But before I could even start to process it, my brother explained further. He said his phone had died while they were in the woods, and Chester was right there at his side when something strange happened. He told me a circular beam of light suddenly appeared around his feet, as if a spotlight had been cast straight down from above. It lasted only a second, maybe less, and then it shot off in one direction, fast. And just like that, Chester was gone. One moment at his side, the next completely vanished. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed a jacket and went out into the dark myself. The cool air hit me as soon as I stepped outside, and I could smell the damp earth and faint musk of the woods. It didn't take long to reach the tree line, no more than half a minute, and soon I was swallowed by the dark. Even though the woods were so close, they felt like a different world entirely at night. My boots sank into the soft ground as I pushed forward, every step crunching on leaves or twigs. I wasn't even in there a full minute before I spotted him. Chester was behind a big tree, his outline faint at first in the gloom until I got close enough to be sure. Relief washed over me, but almost immediately that feeling gave way to something else. He wasn't right. The way he stood there was wrong. His tail was tucked between his legs, his head low, his whole body tense. He wasn't wagging, wasn't bounding toward me like he usually did. Instead, he moved toward the house with a slowness I'd never seen in him before, his paws dragging like he was half reluctant to take each step. I followed him back, watching every small movement, and the silence in those woods pressed down harder than usual. Normally at night, you could hear the faint rustle of animals, an owl calling, or even just the wind moving through the trees. But that night, there was nothing. The quiet was so complete it almost rang in my ears. When we got back to the house, Chester didn't pause at the door or look back at the woods. He walked straight inside, went to his bed, and lay down. That was it. No circling, no pacing around the kitchen like he often did, no pawing for attention. He just collapsed into his spot with his head low. I stood there for a long time trying to make sense of it. This was a dog who had grown up running those woods, chasing after scents, darting between trees, full of confidence no matter the time of day or night. For him to come back trembling, tail tucked, moving like he'd been broken down by something, it was completely out of character. I kept thinking about what my brother had described. The phone dying, the circle of light on the ground, the sudden disappearance of the dog. I wanted to dismiss it as some quirk of his imagination, but Chester's behavior was evidence in itself. Something had happened out there, something that stripped away his usual boldness and left him shaken to his core. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the woods in that heavy silence, Chester standing stiff and trembling, and the thought of that strange light my brother swore he saw. The farm has always felt like home, safe and familiar, and the woods were part of that. But after that night, they felt different. When I looked at the tree line from the window, it was no longer just trees and shadow. It was a place where something had unsettled a dog that had never shown fear there in his life. In the days that followed, Chester stayed different. He didn't want to go out at night anymore. He'd linger by the door, hesitant, sometimes refusing to step off the porch. Even during the day, he was slower, quieter, almost like he carried the weight of whatever happened with him. His eyes seemed more alert, scanning the woods like he was waiting for something to come back. I kept replaying everything in my head, searching for a reasonable explanation. Maybe it was a trick of the light, maybe some animal startled him, maybe his age was finally catching up to him. But none of that explained the circular beam my brother saw or the way Chester behaved afterward. It didn't explain how a dog that fearless could return moving like a shadow of himself. The memory of finding him behind that tree, stiff and trembling, stuck with me. The silence in the woods stuck with me too. Even now, whenever I step toward the treeline at night, I feel that same heavy quiet pressing in, as if the air itself is waiting. I never did figure out what really happened that night, and maybe I never will. But I know this much: something out there changed Chester. And when you live on the edge of the woods, with the dark stretching out just beyond your doorstep, that thought is enough to change you too. It was still dark when I left camp, the kind of dark that presses in close and makes every step feel uncertain. My breath fogged in the cold morning air, and the smell of damp earth and pine hung heavy around me. I had been hunting enough times to know the routine by heart. Wake up before dawn, gear up quietly, and get out to the blind before first light. My dad had drilled into me the importance of how you walk through the woods. He always said if you want to blend in, you can't sound like a steady march of boots. You have to move in bursts, pausing often so it doesn't alert every animal within 100 yards. So that's what I did, 15 yards or so, stop, listen, then move again. At first, it was just the normal sounds of the woods, branches creaking as they swayed, the occasional drip of dew falling off leaves, the crunch of my own boots on the frosted ground. But not long into the walk, I started to notice something that didn't sit right. Every time I stopped, I swore I could hear another set of steps behind me. Soft, careful, but there. And when I froze, the sound froze too. The first couple of times I told myself it was just the echo of my own movements bouncing through the trees, or maybe a deer that happened to be moving the same direction I was. But the pattern kept repeating. I go another 15 yards, stop, listen. And behind me, a faint crunch of leaves would come a second too late, like something else was keeping my rhythm. Then silence. My heart started working faster, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than usual. My headlamp beam cut through the dark in a narrow cone, but all I ever saw was mist rising from the ground and the pale outlines of trunks fading into shadow. The trail felt longer than it usually did, like the woods were stretching themselves out just to keep me in that uneasy in-between space. I tried to keep steady, telling myself not to break into a nervous rush. Running never helped anything out here, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The silence after the footsteps stopped was almost worse than the noise itself, like whatever was back there was holding its breath with me. Finally, after what felt like much longer than it was, I made it to the blind. I unzipped the flap quickly and slipped inside, pulling the zipper back down with a steady hand even though I wanted to yank it shut as fast as possible. Inside it was pitch black, but at least there was the thin barrier of canvas between me and the rest of the woods. I sat down, set my rifle across my lap, and forced myself to take slow breaths. The footsteps didn't stop, though. I heard them again, closer now, circling. The sound of leaves being pressed into the earth, deliberate, testing. My chest tightened. The blind wasn't much of a defense, just fabric and poles. I tried to tell myself it was still just a deer or maybe a coyote nosing around, but then I heard the pace change. Whatever it was, it crept up close enough that I swore it was right outside the blind. The hair on my arms stood up. I made a noise, not words, just a sharp sound from my throat, loud enough to cut through the quiet. The reaction was instant. I heard the thing bolt, heavy steps thundering up the hill behind me, leaves scattering under its weight. My pulse was racing, but before I could even convince myself that the threat had passed, the woods erupted with noise that froze me in place. A howl rang out from the top of the hill, long, drawn out, deep enough to vibrate in my chest. Then another answered it, sharper, from somewhere off to the side. Then more joined in, overlapping, rising and falling in eerie harmony until it seemed like the whole forest was alive with them. A series of howls all around me, spreading out through the dark. Wolves. It hit me hard, the realization that what had been shadowing me in the dark wasn't a deer, wasn't a coyote, but wolves pacing me step for step. The sound of their voices wasn't like anything else I'd heard in the wild. Coyotes yip and bark in a frantic pitch, but these were deeper, steadier, colder. They carried authority, warning, a claim to the ground I was sitting on. I stayed completely still inside the blind, every muscle locked. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, but I didn't move to adjust my jacket or shift my weight. The howls kept echoing, some closer, some farther, until I couldn't tell how many wolves there were. At least 3, maybe more. The sound of them moving through the brush was faint, but I caught it. Quick bursts of paws over leaves, breaking twigs, then silence again. They were shifting, spreading out, circling the way they did when they hunted. Every second stretched. My ears strained for every sound. My eyes darted to the flap of the blind, even though I knew I couldn't see through it. I gripped the stock of my rifle tighter, not because I planned to shoot. I knew firing blind into the dark wasn't an option, but because it was the only thing grounding me. The howls came again, and I noticed the tone was different. Less sharp now, almost testing. They knew I was there, they had followed me the whole way, and now they were letting me know I was inside their territory. My heart pounded harder with the thought that they might not just be warning me. Wolves are intelligent. They size up situations, they probe weaknesses, they learn fast. I sat there wondering if they saw me as a hunter in a blind, or just prey that had put itself into a flimsy shelter. Minutes passed, maybe longer, and slowly the chorus of howls began to thin. One by one, the voices drifted farther into the distance, until only one remained, calling out every so often as it faded deeper into the trees. Then it was silent again, the kind of silence that feels loaded, where you're never sure if it's truly empty or just waiting for you to make the next move. I stayed frozen in my seat long after the last sound died away. My legs cramped, my hands went numb from holding the rifle too tightly, but I didn't shift. I wasn't going to be the first to move. Eventually, the first gray light of dawn started to seep in through the seams of the blind, enough to cast a faint outline on my hands. Only then did I allow myself to breathe steady again. When I finally unzipped the flap and looked out, the woods were quiet, but not calm. The air felt different, as if something had just passed through and left its mark. The trail I had walked in on showed no obvious signs of them, but I didn't need prints to know what had been there. The memory of the howls was still echoing in my ears. That morning, I didn't see a single deer. I didn't even stay out long after the sun came up. I packed myself back to camp with every sense on high alert, my head turning at every crack of a branch. The woods had shown me something I couldn't forget. Being stalked like that, hearing those wolves just out of sight, it stripped away any illusion of control I thought I had out there. From then on, every time I walked into the woods before dawn, I carried that memory with me. The sound of those footsteps matching mine, the sudden rush of them running up the hill, the way the howls layered over each other in the darkness. It was a reminder that out there, I wasn't the only one hunting, and it didn't matter how much experience I thought I had. For those long minutes in the blind, I wasn't the predator. I was the one being watched, sized up, and tested in the dark. I still remember that night so clearly, even though years have passed. It remains one of the strangest and most unsettling things that ever happened to me. I had gone to sleep in the woods in my tent, with the sounds of crickets and owls in the distance, the smell of damp pine needles around me, the cool air brushing against my face every time I shifted inside my sleeping bag. I had done plenty of camping before, so I felt comfortable enough out there, even when it was just dark trees and endless shadows around me. But the way that night ended has never left me. I had been with my parents, camping in an area not far from home. It wasn't the kind of wild place you needed to hike days into. It was just deep enough into the woods that you couldn't see houses or hear cars, but still within a short drive to the nearest town. My parents set up their tent, and I set up mine not far from theirs. We ate a simple meal, sat by a fire for a little while, and eventually turned in for the night. Everything about it felt normal. I remember lying in my tent, staring at the thin fabric lit faintly by the moon. I could hear branches creaking and the occasional rustle of leaves as small animals moved around. My sleeping bag was warm, and I slowly drifted off to sleep, the kind of heavy sleep that comes after a full day outside. The next thing I knew, I wasn't in the woods anymore. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't staring at the sloped walls of my tent or the faint light of the moon shining through thin nylon. I was in a bed, a real bed, with sheets tucked around me and a heavy blanket on top. The air smelled different, warmer, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of furniture polish and something baked earlier in the day. I blinked hard, trying to clear the fog of sleep, trying to make sense of it. For a long moment, my brain simply refused to process what I was seeing. I was supposed to be in the woods, but here I was, in a room I didn't recognize at first, with walls around me instead of trees, a lamp on a dresser, a window with curtains. Confusion washed over me, and then panic followed. I sat up quickly, my heart racing, looking around the room. My first thought was that maybe I had dreamed the camping entirely, but I knew that wasn't right. I remembered zipping up the tent, settling into my bag, listening to the sounds of the forest. I had gone to sleep there. There was no mistake. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, feeling the carpet under my feet instead of dirt and pine needles. It was jarring. My stomach felt tight, like something bad had happened, though I didn't yet know what. I walked to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to look out. The view showed a backyard, dim in the early morning light, with a swing set, a garden, and trees at the far end. It didn't make sense to me. Then I realized where I was. It was the house of a family friend, someone my parents had known for years. I had been here before, for barbecues and visits, though I had never spent the night. The realization didn't calm me. If anything, it made things stranger. Why was I here? How had I gone to sleep in a tent in the woods and woken up in this house? I pieced it together slowly over the morning as memories came back in fragments. My parents had moved me. At some point during the night, probably close to midnight, they had woken me, guided me out of the tent, and taken me to the car. I must have been half asleep, so disoriented that I didn't register what was happening. They drove me here to this house and put me in the spare room to sleep. I had been so deeply asleep that by the time I woke again, it felt as though I had simply teleported. Knowing that still didn't stop the unease from crawling under my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The woods had felt safe, even in their darkness, because I had chosen to be there. I had zipped myself into my tent and settled down in a space I controlled. Waking up somewhere else without memory of the move stripped away that sense of safety completely. I thought about how it had felt when I first opened my eyes in that bed. The stillness of the room had been so different from the restless sounds of the forest. There had been no transition, no slow awareness of being moved. Just sleep in one place and waking in another. That gap in memory left me unsettled for weeks. Later, I found out why my parents had done it. The storm had been rolling in while I slept, and the winds in the trees were stronger than I realized. They didn't want to risk staying out there all night. The nearest safe option was this family friend's house, not far from where we had camped. Instead of waking me fully, they simply guided me half asleep to the car and drove over. It made sense, and I knew they had only done it for safety. But that didn't erase the raw, hollow feeling of waking up in the wrong place, of losing that gap of time between falling asleep in one world and waking up in another. The thing that stuck with me most wasn't even the storm or the reason behind it. It was that moment of panic when I first opened my eyes and had no idea where I was. For a few seconds, it felt like something had gone terribly wrong, like the world had shifted while I slept and left me behind. Even when I understood it later, the memory of that moment stayed sharp. I never camped the same way again after that. I still went, still loved the woods, but I always made sure I knew exactly what the plan was. If weather looked bad, I wanted to be part of the decision, awake and aware. I wanted to keep that control, however small it might be, because losing it once had been enough to shake me. Looking back now, I realize it wasn't a nightmare in the traditional sense. No monsters, no strangers lurking, no accidents. It was just disorientation. The shock of waking up in a place I hadn't expected. The way my mind scrambled to piece together what had happened. But in some ways, that made it scarier. It wasn't something I could laugh off as fantasy. It was real. It happened. And it taught me just how unsettling it is when the familiar slips away without warning. That morning, walking out into the kitchen to see my parents already sitting with our family friends, drinking coffee like everything was normal, I felt like I had been dropped into someone else's life. Everyone else was calm, casual, talking about the storm. I was the only one still carrying that strange weight in my chest. Even now, when I wake up in a strange place, even if I know why I'm there, I feel that same brief flash of panic. That memory of falling asleep in the woods and waking in a house is something I don't think I'll ever completely shake. It taught me that sometimes the scariest things aren't the noises outside the tent or the shadows moving in the trees. Sometimes it's simply opening your eyes and not recognizing the room around you, realizing that your sense of where you are and how you got there has been torn away. When I think back on that trip, it still makes me shiver, not just because of the storm, but because of how quickly things turned from one extreme to the other. It's strange how in the woods, far from the things you normally rely on, people can go from looking like a threat to feeling like your only lifeline. We had set up camp deep in the forest, the kind of place where you don't hear cars or see distant lights, just trees, mud, and the sound of everything alive around you. It was beautiful during the day, but when the sun went down, the woods pressed in close. The silence wasn't silence at all. It was a blanket of animal calls, branches snapping in the distance, the wind rushing through high canopies you couldn't even see. That night, a storm moved in. I felt it building all day. The air was heavy, the clouds piling thicker as the evening wore on. By the time we crawled into the tent, the sky had cracked open. Rain poured down in sheets, rattling against the nylon so loud it drowned out my thoughts. Lightning flashed through the thin fabric, lighting up the inside of the tent in stark bursts, followed instantly by thunder so strong it shook the ground. Couldn't sleep. I tossed in my bag, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the storm. Sometime around 4 a.m, through the roar of rain and the cracks of thunder, I heard something different. At first, I thought it was part of the storm, but when I stilled myself and really listened, I caught it clearly. Voices. Men's voices. My heart picked up speed. Out here, voices at night weren't comforting. They meant people were close, people we hadn't invited or expected, and people with unknown intentions in the middle of a jungle or forest at night rarely spelled anything good. I pulled myself up, slipped into my damp clothes, and unzipped the tent. The storm hit me like a wall. Rain soaking instantly through fabric, wind whipping at my hair, mud sucking at my boots. I swung my flashlight across the campsite, and that's when I saw them. 2 men, dark outlines at first, walking through the downpour with rifles slung over their shoulders. Everything inside me went cold. 2 armed strangers coming straight toward me in the middle of a storm. It felt like the beginning of something bad. My body tightened, adrenaline rushing, every nerve firing as I tried to figure out what I'd do if they wanted trouble. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. We were exposed, a tent and a fire pit in the middle of the woods. Behind me, I heard the zipper again. My girlfriend stepped out of the tent, against what I had told her. She came to my side, her face pale as she saw the 2 figures closing in. The rain plastered her hair to her head, her clothes already soaking through. My chest felt like it was caught in a vice. The men walked with steady steps, not rushing, not hiding. They looked worn, tired, their faces shining wet in the dim light. The rifles were real, though, and heavy across their shoulders. For a long second, they seemed threatening just by being there. Strangers with weapons at night, intruding on us in a storm that had already stripped away every bit of safety I'd felt. But as they reached the small clearing, something shifted. They weren't aggressive. They weren't demanding. They simply looked like men who had been caught far from shelter in weather they couldn't handle. Hunters, maybe, or locals from nearby villages. Their presence was terrifying at first glance, but once I really looked, I saw it differently. Their shoulders sagged. Their clothes clung to them in soaked layers. Their faces showed exhaustion more than malice. Still, my body didn't let go of the fear right away. It took everything in me not to keep the flashlight trained on them like a weapon, even though I knew how little good it would do. My girlfriend stayed close, and I busied myself with the only thing I could think to do. I pulled out the little stove. The flame hissed weakly in the wind, but it caught, and soon I had water boiling. Coffee. Something warm, something human to cut the tension. The men accepted it, their hands shaking from the cold, steam curling up from the cups into the damp night. It was strange watching the shift happen in real time. One moment I was staring at two strangers with rifles and imagining all the ways it could go wrong. The next I was watching them cup hot drinks in their hands with relief written across their faces. The line between threatening and harmless had thinned to nothing, and it left me rattled in a way I hadn't expected. That was when the storm hit its peak. A flash of lightning lit up everything. The trees, the camp, the hunters' faces, even the raindrops cutting through the air. It was so bright it hurt my eyes. A split second later, thunder cracked so hard it felt like the air itself tore in half. The wind surged, bending trees at their tops. And then came the sound I'll never forget. A low, deep groan of wood giving way. I spun around just in time to see it. A massive tree, one of the giants that had been standing probably longer than I'd been alive, toppled. Its roots ripped free of the soft, soaked earth with a sound like tearing fabric. The trunk crashed down in slow motion, an avalanche of leaves and branches splitting the air. It landed right across our tent. The noise was like an explosion, branches breaking, poles snapping, fabric tearing. Mud splattered up as the ground shook. Our tent flattened instantly, crushed under the full weight of the tree. 1 second it had been the place where we lay trying to sleep. The next it was a mess of broken nylon and splintered branches. My stomach dropped. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, just stared at the wreckage, realizing how close it had been. If I hadn't stepped out to check the voices, if my girlfriend hadn't ignored me and come outside, we'd have been inside that tent, pinned, crushed, dead before we knew what happened. The hunters stared too, their faces pale and shocked, their rifles forgotten at their sides. For a few minutes, the storm was all that filled the silence. Rain hammering down, thunder rolling, wind tearing through the trees. But my mind kept circling back to one thing: we were alive. Alive only because of a chance encounter that had felt threatening until the very moment it saved us. When the storm finally began to ease, I walked toward the fallen tree. The trunk stretched wider than my outstretched arms, heavy and immovable. Branches jutted out like broken bones, leaves scattered across the ground. Our tent was unrecognizable, crushed flat beneath it, everything inside buried or ruined. I dug through the mess for what I could salvage, but most of it was gone. I looked back at the hunters then. They had gone from looking like a danger to being part of what kept us alive. If I hadn't heard them, if I hadn't gone outside, we wouldn't have left that campsite. The thought made my chest tighten in a way that no storm ever could. By morning, the air was calm again. The jungle washed clean, water dripping from every leaf. The hunters had moved on by then, vanishing back into the trees the way they'd come. My girlfriend and I packed what little we had left, shaken but breathing. The memory of that night has never left me. The storm was terrifying, but the real fear came from realizing how fragile everything is out there. One moment strangers with rifles were the scariest part of the night. The next moment they were drinking coffee with us while a tree destroyed the place we'd been sleeping. That shift, that thin line between threat and salvation, is what has stayed with me. Out there in the woods, you don't get to choose how things unfold. Sometimes the very thing you're afraid of is the only reason you're still standing when the danger passes. I had been camping for a couple of nights already, set up in a quiet patch of woods that sat between rolling hills and open pastureland. It wasn't the most remote trip I had ever done, but it was far enough from town that at night the silence felt heavy. The only real sounds were the wind in the trees, the occasional rustle of something small in the brush, and the chorus of crickets and frogs. It was peaceful during the day, but nighttime brought its own kind of unease. Out there in the dark, even a small noise could make your body tense and your imagination wander. That night had been like most of the others. I made a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat back to watch the flames burn down into glowing coals. When the fire dimmed and the air turned cool, I crawled into my tent and settled into my sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly, as it usually did in the woods. The ground pressed against my back. Every sound outside was amplified, and my mind kept circling through thoughts until exhaustion finally pulled me under. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with the sudden urge to pee. It was one of those feelings that wouldn't go away no matter how much I tried to ignore it. The air inside the tent was stuffy, and I could already feel the pressure in my bladder, making it impossible to drift back to sleep. I sighed, sat up, unzipped the tent, and stepped out into the night. The air outside was cooler than I expected, damp with the smell of earth and leaves. My campfire had burned completely out, leaving only faint gray ash in the circle of rocks. The moon hung low in the sky, half hidden behind drifting clouds, which made the woods around me look even darker. My flashlight beam cut through the shadows, but I didn't want to use it too much, knowing it would kill my night vision. I moved a short distance from camp, enough that I wouldn't have to deal with the smell near my tent in the morning, and squatted behind a tree. It should have been a routine thing, one of those annoying but necessary parts of camping. But as soon as I lowered myself down, I felt it, the sense of being watched. At first, I thought it was just nerves. The woods always had a way of playing tricks on you when you were alone in the dark. But then I looked up, and that's when I saw it. There, maybe 20 feet away, standing half in the shadows, was a cow. Not the kind of animal you expect to see in the woods at night. Its body was broad and heavy, its head lifted and facing directly toward me. The moonlight caught its eyes, and they reflected back at me with an eerie shine. It wasn't chewing, it wasn't moving. It was just staring, dead still, dead silent, right at me. The shock of it made my whole body seize up. I froze where I was, squatting and exposed, my muscles tightening as though holding still would make me invisible. My mind spun in circles trying to make sense of it. I hadn't seen any farms nearby, no fences, no open pasture close enough for livestock to wander in. Yet here it was, a cow out in the woods, watching me like it had been waiting. I finished as quickly as I could, my movements stiff and awkward under its gaze. Every second I felt its eyes locked on me, unblinking, fixed in a way that made me deeply uneasy. There was no sound of breathing, no shuffle of hooves, not even the flick of a tail, just silence and that heavy stare. When I finally stood back up, my legs shaky, the cow didn't move. It didn't lower its head, it didn't turn away. It only stood there, broad-shouldered and solid against the dark backdrop of the trees, watching me as though it had been caught in the middle of something. The size of it hit me then. Cows aren't small. Up close, in the dark, they're massive. Heavy bodies, thick muscles, and unpredictable temperaments. I realized that if it decided to charge, I had nowhere to go and nothing to defend myself with. I backed up slowly, trying not to make any sudden movements, my flashlight clutched in my hand. The beam passed over its face, and for a split second its features lit up. The wide, wet nose, the glassy eyes, the blank yet piercing stare. I felt my skin crawl as I turned the light away. Step by step, I moved back toward my tent, expecting at any moment for it to follow. The silence behind me felt loaded. I couldn't bring myself to look again, afraid that if I turned my head, I'd see it closer, maybe moving toward me. My pulse hammered in my ears, and the woods suddenly felt alive in a way I hadn't noticed before. Every shadow stretched and heavy. When I reached my tent, I ducked inside as fast as I could and zipped it closed. It felt flimsy, that thin nylon fabric, as though it wouldn't stop anything if the cow decided to come closer. I sat there in the dark, listening, my ears strained for the sound of hooves against dirt or branches snapping under its weight. But all I heard was the steady thrum of crickets and the faint rustle of wind through leaves. Still, I couldn't shake the image of it standing there, motionless, staring. Eventually, exhaustion won out. I don't remember when I drifted back to sleep, but I remember waking up at first light, the pale sun creeping across the trees and spilling into camp. The world looked different in daylight, calmer, safer. My fear from the night before felt almost ridiculous under the warm glow of morning. But when I stepped out of my tent, I noticed something. Just beyond where I had gone to relieve myself, the ground was disturbed. Deep impressions pressed into the dirt, wide and heavy. Hoof prints. They led in from the tree line, stopped right at the spot where I had seen the cow, and then turned back toward the woods. The prints were large, clearly fresh, pressed into the soft earth from the night's dew. It hadn't been my imagination. I followed the trail a short distance into the trees, my curiosity overriding my nerves. The prints cut through brush and dirt, leading off in a direction that made no sense. They didn't head toward an open pasture or a farm. They went deeper into the woods, winding between trees until they disappeared in a tangle of undergrowth. That was the part that unsettled me most. I had no explanation for why a cow would be out there, alone, wandering the forest at night. Livestock don't roam into dense woods without reason. They stick to open ground, to grazing areas, to where people keep them. But this one had been out there, deep enough to stumble across me in the middle of nowhere, and it had stood completely still, watching me like it understood something I didn't. All day, I couldn't shake the feeling that it had carried something back with it. I imagined it wandering back to wherever it had come from, carrying with it the image of me frozen and exposed in the dark. I pictured it meeting up with other cows, all of them silent and still, passing along that look, that story, like they had shared some secret understanding. By the time I packed up camp later that day, the woods didn't feel the same anymore. It wasn't the coyotes or the mountain lions I was worried about. It was the thought of that cow out there somewhere, roaming the trees, watching in silence. A creature I thought I understood completely had become something strange, something unsettling, simply because of the way it appeared and the way it had looked at me. It was just a cow, I reminded myself, nothing more. But the memory of those eyes locked on mine stayed with me long after I left those woods. Wolves had always been something I thought about in passing when planning camping trips, but never in any serious way. Most of the time, they avoid people. That's what I told myself every time I packed my gear and drove out into the wild. But one night in particular changed the way I thought about being alone in the woods. I had taken a few days off work and wanted to spend them in solitude, away from noise and people. I headed out to a remote forested area, a good hike in from the trailhead. It was the kind of trip where I knew I wouldn't see anyone else once I left the parking lot behind. The air smelled sharp with pine, and the ground was soft with layers of needles and damp soil. It was late summer, and though the evenings got cold, the days were still warm enough to make hiking comfortable. My pack felt heavy but manageable, and I had that restless excitement that comes with knowing you'll be truly cut off for a few nights. By the time I found a spot to camp, the sun was already sinking low. I picked a flat stretch of ground near a line of thick trees, with just enough space to set up the tent and build a fire pit. There was a faint trail nearby that I assumed deer had made, but otherwise it felt like the middle of nowhere. I dropped my pack, stretched out my back, and started setting up camp. The rhythm of the tasks, tent, firewood, meal, put me in a calm mood. I cooked, ate, and sat watching the fire until the last glow of daylight drained from the trees. When I crawled into my tent that night, the forest felt alive in the way it always does after dark. Every sound carried farther, sharper. The crack of a branch, the rustle of something moving through the underbrush, the soft rush of wind moving across the canopy. I dozed, woke, dozed again. Nothing unusual. At some point deep into the night, I woke to a noise that didn't sound like the usual nighttime scurry. It was heavier, more deliberate. My eyes opened instantly, and I lay still, my ears straining. There it was again. Slow steps through the undergrowth, circling close to the edge of camp. The fire had long since gone cold, and the only light came from the thin slice of moon filtering through the trees. I reached for the knife I kept by my sleeping bag, my fingers curling around the handle, not because I thought it would do much, but because it gave me something to hold on to. The steps paused. Then came the sound that froze me completely, low, drawn out, almost like a breath but deeper. A growl. Not the startled noise of a raccoon or a deer, but the sound of a predator letting its presence be known. My body went rigid. A wolf. The thought slammed into my head before I even had time to reason it out. I had read enough, heard enough to recognize that sound. It was close, maybe 20 feet away. I didn't move. My breathing slowed as I tried to control the urge to bolt. Running would be the worst possible thing to do. I stayed in the tent, every sense straining. The wolf circled for what felt like forever. I heard the crunch of its paws against twigs, the occasional exhale of breath. Once, it stepped close enough that I swore I could hear the shift of its weight against the dirt. I pictured it standing there, ears forward, eyes catching the faint light. My thin nylon tent felt like nothing at all between me and it. I remembered the advice I'd read once. Don't act like prey. Don't run. If it comes to it, make yourself big, make noise. I rehearsed it in my head, though I couldn't bring myself to unzip the tent and face it in the darkness. I figured the noise of the zipper alone might trigger something I couldn't control. Minutes dragged by, maybe hours. I couldn't tell. At some point, the noises faded. The steps grew softer, then disappeared entirely. I stayed frozen long after, waiting, listening, my knife still clutched tight. Eventually, exhaustion forced me into a restless half-sleep, where every dream seemed to merge with the sounds I had heard outside. When the gray light of morning finally seeped through the tent walls, I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The air was damp and cold, the forest quiet. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. Then I saw them. Tracks large, unmistakable paw prints pressed into the soft dirt just beyond the tent. They circled the site, looping near the fire pit, skirting close to where I had been sleeping. My chest tightened as I crouched and traced one of them with my hand. Fresh. Too fresh to be anything but last night. The unease didn't leave me as I packed up camp. Every time I glanced into the trees, I felt eyes on me, even though nothing stirred. The forest no longer felt calm or quiet, it felt watchful. I didn't linger. I tightened my pack straps and headed back toward the trail, my knife still at my hip, every crunch of my boots against the dirt louder than it should have been. The hike back felt longer than the hike in. Every shadow looked like movement. Every broken branch sounded like a step behind me. I checked over my shoulder more times than I could count. The wolf never showed itself again, but I knew it had been there, and that was enough. By the time I reached the trailhead and saw the empty gravel lot, I felt the tension drain only slightly. I loaded my gear into the car, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there for a long while before starting the engine. I kept thinking about the way those tracks circled my camp. That wolf hadn't just passed through, it had studied me. It had come close enough to test the situation, close enough to remind me how thin the line is out there between me and something that lives entirely by instinct. I drove away, but the feeling stuck with me. Camping still calls to me, but after that night, I've never been able to lie down in a tent without glancing at the tree line and wondering what might be standing just beyond the reach of the light. That night taught me something simple and hard. The wild doesn't care how prepared you think you are. Out there, you're just another animal. And sometimes the animals that own that land remind you of it.